Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. This is our first public lecture of 2025, so welcome to it. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, along with programs related to Jewish-Christian understanding in particular, and to the understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Rich Higgins back to campus. And when I say back, I do so not only because Rich is a member of the Holy Cross class of 1974, but also because he's spoken here in Ream Library in the past, where he discussed his book, Thoreau and the Language of Trees, which was published by the University of California Press in 2017. Today, Rich discusses a new book called Thoreau's God, which was recently published by the University of Chicago Press, a book that apparently has some of its roots and ideas that Rich discussed here way back in 2017. And he has a few copies of the book available if anyone wants to purchase one later. After Holy Cross, Rich received degrees from Columbia Journalism School and the Harvard Divinity School. He's had a distinguished career as a staff writer for the Boston Globe, worked as an editor and book coach, written or edited 4 books, and written shorter pieces for the New York Times, Washington Post, Christian Century, Harvard Divinity Bulletin, American Scholar, and other publications. Today he'll help us explore Henry David Thoreau's spiritual life. Though a harsh critic of respectable Christianity of his day, Thoreau, as we'll see, was also a mystic with a deep reverence for the sacredness of life. And Rich will help us, I think, reframe some of what you may have heard or thought about Thoreau's spiritual beliefs. So please join me in welcoming Rich Higgins.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here only 6 months or 7 months ago for my 50th college reunion. And at that reunion, Father Keith Muccino gave a great invocation, to the Purple Night dinner there at Hogan. And I really was impressed by it, and I asked him for a copy. And so I did that. No sooner had I turned away than a classmate, I didn't know too well, I said, "Oh, gee, I want a copy too. Would you mind sending that to me?" I said, "Sure, give me your email, I'll send it to you." So I got home and I read the prayer again, and I was moved by it, and put it in a pile on my desk. And there it stayed until about 3 weeks ago. Just completely forgot about it. And I was trying to throw stuff out, so I was thank you, Tom. I was standing over the wastebasket thinking, I don't need this piece of paper. But something stayed my hand. I hadn't done something I said I would do. So I went to my copy, I scanned it, I emailed it to this guy. And he was delighted to get it. And we both agreed, better late than never. And he said that it showed my character formation at Holy Cross, that I didn't throw it out. And I think he may be right. And that's a great thing about Holy Cross. So I also want to say that it's a pleasure to bring Thoreau back to Worcester in the respect that Thoreau had a coterie of friends, admirers in Worcester, chiefly H.G.O. Blake, who was a Unitarian minister and school teacher, who was kind of like a disciple of Thoreau's. Thoreau wrote 50 letters to Blake that were really like epistles about the meaning of life, vocation, spirituality, really profound letters. And Blake would read them to this group of friends usually at one of the shop of one of the admirers, Theo Brown, who was a tailor. And his tailor shop was at Pearl Street and Main Street in Worcester. And among those who would show up for these readings of Thoreau's letters were Edward Everett Hale, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, John Weiss, all 3 of whom were liberal Unitarian ministers, and others. And Theo Brown, the tailor, and Blake would go to visit Thoreau in Concord, and Thoreau would come here and stay at Brown's house in Worcester. So there's a real connection there. Excuse me. So a story is told about a elderly woman, word I always use very cautiously these days, who used to visit the graves of the famous authors buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. It's called Authors Ridge. And supposedly she would put flowers on Emerson's grave, and then when she got to Thoreau, she would say, "And none for you, you dirty little atheist." And I think that that woman would no doubt be surprised by the title of my book, Thoreau's God. And I think that there are people like her today who also think that it's an oxymoron. But I think it's a little more complicated than that, and that it's better understood as a riddle, and that's how I'm going to present it. Now, Thoreau grew up in First Parish in Concord, the Puritan church that in Thoreau's lifetime was Unitarian, but the Unitarians were still Christian at that time. And he went to a Sunday school. Thoreau didn't like schools or churches, and a church school was definitely not up his alley. But it gave him a familiarity with the Bible that would deepen and become a key part of his unique literary style. And it's where he heard about the ideal of Christianity. Thoreau thought, as Tom said, the respectable churches of his day failed that ideal, and even in their slowness to come around to the opposing slavery, opposed it practically. But Thoreau never completely gave up on the ideal of Christianity. When the husk gets separated from the kernel, men run after the husk and pay their respects to that, he wrote in 1860. It is only the husk of Christianity that is so brooded about these days in the world. The kernel is still the rarest of all things. There is not a single church founded on it. And he wrote that 2 years before he died. So, now it is true, it is true that Thoreau railed against his Calvinist heritage, calling it an ancient and tottering frame with all its boards blown off. And he found its doctrines despairing, its clergy cowardly, its rituals superstitious, and its God remote, yet all-controlling. So his attacks on organized religion, together with his defiant religious pluralism, he embraced all different faiths, thought God was not on the side of any one sect, his nature mysticism, and his reluctance to define his innermost religious feelings have all contributed to the sense that he was a secular force of nature, spiritual, but only in some vague, eclectic way, grounded entirely in the natural world and unmoored from common understandings of religion. Now, that view, which is prevalent among scholars, is not without justification, but I think it more likely projects the secularism of our culture and academic studies in particular, perhaps not here at Holy Cross. I say that because it omits the palpable, undeniable presence of divine mystery in Thoreau's writing. I don't mean in his polemical writings about religion. I mean his sincere and searching remarks about God and his occasional emotional speech to God in his journal. Thoreau was religious to the bone and had a profound sense of the holy. If his views were iconoclastic, his experience of the divine in nature was often rapturous. He disavowed systematic theology, but he spoke of and sought communion with a mystery at the heart of the universe that was at once immanent or present in nature and yet transcendent. Now, explaining that secret to others was not important. Experiencing it was what mattered. Formal religion with its doctrines and creeds was irrelevant to the religion that he sought in nature, a religion by revelation, as Emerson called it, or as Thoreau put it, a newer testament, the gospel according to this moment. Now, in slighting this deep vein in Thoreau, we miss an essential part of who he was. His religious sensibility was a central thread in his life and is woven through his scalding critiques of slavery, racism, our materialist culture, and our exploitation of natural resources. It grounds his philosophical views on government and how we relate to the natural world, and it gives us a better sense of who he was and what motivated him. To understand this side of Thoreau, we have to look beyond his formal beliefs and affiliations. Religion for Thoreau was a way of living and a fundamental attitude about life, one of openness to divine mystery and a desire to draw closer to it. It was less a compilation of beliefs than a set of internal possibilities about how to live, what to notice, and what to love. Quote, "Without religion or devotion of some kind," he wrote, "nothing great can be accomplished." Thoreau was a born seeker. He had an inherent sense of reverence, and if one reads him carefully, humility, at least regarding the holy. He bowed before nature's mysteries. The trees, he said, point to a place where our feet cannot take us. His keen awareness of a hidden, numinous dimension of reality, along with the religious liberalism that he developed at Harvard and as a member of Concord's Transcendentalist Circle, inclined him toward a spiritual outlook on life. Thoreau saw the world as either sacred or profane, and he desired as much as possible to live in the former and eschew the latter. Thoreau's spirituality was grounded in disciplined observation and sensory experience. His daily visits to the woods, fields, and waters of Concord set his spiritual wheels in motion. A cock crowing at dawn, light slanting in golden rays through a forest at sunset, the aromatic smell of pine, or a delicate robin nest could elicit his awe. Thoreau's spiritual experiences in nature were moments of awakening that defied what he called the common laws of everyday New England Yankee life. They were inklings of a different order of truth that turned ordinary perception upside down. He loved, for example, to listen to the eerie, whale-like sounds emitted by the telegraph poles along the railroad as the wires above vibrated in the wind. The pith of the pole would actually emit this high-pitched but vacillating sound, and he was entranced by it. He described the sounds as coming from heaven or on high or another world. And the message he heard in the music of the telegraph poles, quote, "stings my ear with everlasting truth. It always intoxicates me, makes me sane, reverses my view of things." While these moments of union with the ultimate were authoritative for Thoreau, they were also inexpressible. Emerson understood this well. Quote, "Our faith comes in moments," he wrote in The Oversoul, his essay, The Oversoul. "Our vice is habitual. Yet there is a depth in those brief moments which constrains us to ascribe more reality to them and to all other experiences," close quote. Although such moments were a fraction of Thoreau's life, they formed a foundation for the rest of it. But Thoreau also had a sense, and this is really what I'm driving at in my book, Thoreau's God, of what William James called the reality of the unseen, an invisible realm toward which Thoreau said he was drawn by a, quote, "continual drift and instinct to all my shores." Quote, "I was always conscious of sounds in nature which my ears could never hear, that I caught but the prelude to a strain. She always retreats as I advance. Away and behind is she and her meaning. I never saw to the end, nor heard to the end, but the best part was unseen and unheard." Now, Thoreau disdained the abstract, labyrinthine systems of thought that Christianity and other religions have tended to produce over the centuries. So he's not a likely candidate to take systematic theology here at Holy Cross. If Thoreau believed anything, it was that all forms of life are unified by a creative energy unbounded by space and time. But it was the believing, not the particular belief, that was most important to him. Quote, that we have but little faith is not sad, but that we have but little faithfulness, he wrote, Blake in 1848. By faithfulness, faith is earned. Emerson wrote that the soul, quote, never reasons, never proves, it simply perceives. This was an article of faith for Thoreau. His spiritual experience was rooted in direct, unmediated perception. To Thoreau, faith happens when we do not have to believe, but come into contact with the truth in a direct and intimate way. Faith is also fluid for Thoreau, less a conviction of the mind than a motion of the soul. People show their faith, or lack of it, in how they live. Quote, the only faith men recognize is a creed, but the true creed, which we unconsciously live by, and which rather adopts us than we it, is often different from the written or preached one. Thoreau doubted that the highest truths could be captured in rational discourse. To frame God in objective terms is to put our knowledge above God's transcendence. A God whose veil could be ripped aside by the human mind is not a God worthy of being reverenced. Quote, the destiny of the soul can never be studied by reason, for its modes are not ecstatic, Thoreau wrote. I cannot convince myself. God must convince. Thoreau was deeply influenced by ancient Hindu texts, in particular the Bhagavad Gita, as Professor Lewis, who is here, knows very well, which he called one of the noblest and most sacred of world scriptures, and it arrived in Concord shortly before he went to Walden, and he borrowed that copy and kept it with him in his house at Walden Pond. He learned from the Gita about the value of right or disinterested action, that is, doing what we're called to do irrespective of the outcome, as a path to self-transformation. It's not indifferent when I say disinterested, but it's following one's mission or dharma because it is your mission or dharma, not because of the consequences it will yield. Thoreau was drawn to the Vedic texts of India by their admission of uncertainty and their acknowledgement of the mysterious nature of the divine. Quote, in their very indistinctness, a sublime truth is implied, he wrote in his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. So the sublime truth in these scriptures is that it hardly allows the reader to rest in any supreme first cause, but directly it hints at a supremer one still, which caused the last. Now, I don't see Thoreau as a confirmed theist, but I do think he was open to and sought union with a divine mystery that was at once immanent in nature and yet not contained by it. He called this illimitable presence many names, but he often called it God, something he did more often than commonly appreciated, and one reason that I began my book. I should say that Thoreau was ambivalent about the word God. It was tarnished by starchy piety and conveyed too much certainty about something he saw as ineffable, or that which surpasses the capacity of language to express it. Thoreau used the word God in a letter to his friend Blake here in Worcester, then appeared to have second thoughts. Let God alone, this is what he wrote, let God alone if need be. Methinks if I loved him more, I should keep myself rather, at a more respectful distance. It is not when I am going to meet him, but just when I am turning away and leaving him alone that I discover that God is. I say God. I'm not sure that is the name. You will know whom I mean. Yet while Thoreau insisted on that ineffability, the inability to describe God, which is allied with the tradition known as negative theology, where the idea is simply that we cannot say what God is, we can only say what God is not. So while Thoreau was insisted on that ineffability as a religious thinker, and he really was a religious thinker, as a literary artist, which was his truest vocation, he somewhat paradoxically used rich figurative imagery to portray God as the ultimate creative force. Indeed, it's remarkable that God, uppercase, appears 250 times in the Princeton edition of Thoreau's journal. That's the scholarly edition that is very scrupulous about such things, and that excludes editorial matter and common expressions. Thoreau referred to God many more times if one includes his poetic references to the great artist, the great maker, the great teacher, or the author and ruler of the universe, and his many other creative names for God. Now, you have to say that God was a part of the furniture of the mind of the mid-19th century, and some of Thoreau's uses of it are pro forma or even sarcastic. However, it is fair to say that the majority of the time, Thoreau refers to God without cant or question, and a smaller number of those references stand out as thoughtful, deliberate, and poignant speech about a benevolent but also disorienting presence that Thoreau seeks to know, wonders about, is shaken by, derives happiness from, and thrills to experience. Thoreau's God was an infinite, life-giving presence. It was a God of wildness, surprise, and change. Yet it was at the same time benign and loving. In moments of ecstasy, Thoreau wrote with an emotional certainty about this source, but his belief in a personal God was contingent, never final, more of a moving toward than an arriving at. But however tentative his conviction, Thoreau's fleeting glimpses and tastes of the divine deeply moved him and fueled his religious imagination. Now, I said earlier that Thoreau found God in the beauty and harmony of nature, which he did, in the breezes that rippled Walden Pond, the gem-like colors of a pickerel, the buds that swell in spring, and the leaves in autumn that teach us how to die. But Thoreau also experienced God in the claw and tooth of nature, in its chaos, decay, and predation, in the storms that level forests, waves that crush ships, and the wild dive of the hawk at its prey. Thoreau saw a radical otherness and transformative wildness in God. It was the ungovernable and inexhaustible spirit of life, and it was holy. Quote, "There is in my nature, methinks, a singular yearning toward all wildness," he wrote in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. To connect with it was to be fully human for Thoreau. The wild, as Thoreau conceived of it, was a regenerative, remedial, and liberating spiritual force that is both in us and at the same time larger than us. So humans are part and parcel of nature, but they do not contain all the wildness in the world. The Almighty, Thoreau wrote in his journal, is wild above all. Now, Thoreau's ideas about God evolved from the more personal theism of his early writing, in which he writes often in a direct way about his desire to know God or love of God, in his early writing, to a more integrative conception of divinity in the 1850s that merged the mystical and the material. But such differences were of degrees, however, and his theological thought did not evolve in a straight line. So he wrote more about a personal God in the years before Walden appeared, but his earliest journal entries from before Walden have mystical passages in which his consciousness is merged with nature. And then his writings after Walden when he was doing most of his natural history, are punctuated by references to a personal God, which continue to appear as late as 1861, the year before Thoreau died, when he wrote the abolitionist minister Parker Pillsbury, quote, "Blessed are they who never read a newspaper, for they shall see nature, and through her, God." Now, Thoreau sometimes spoke in diffuse terms about an impersonal, abstract divine mind in nature, similar to Emerson's Oversoul, or that intelligence in the universe to which every soul has access. But Thoreau was also stamped by his Christian heritage and consistently drew on its theological frameworks to conceive in creative ways of a personal creator God. This was not the distant God of deism, the clockmaker God who's absent from the universe, remote from the world it spun into being. Thoreau rather speaks of a divine mystery to which he feels personally related. Instead of the foreboding and distant deity of his childhood swooping down from on high as a judge, the God Thoreau knew was close at hand, woven into every twig, trunk, and blade. It was this interior feeling of being in relation to the source of life that was the taproot of religion for Thoreau, which is the central idea of the German theologian Schleiermacher, that religion is about interior feeling. Thoreau gives fullest expression to that view in Walden, indeed making the pond a symbol of God. Transcendence is woven through Walden's vision of the natural world. In the chapter Solitude, for example, he writes, "Nearest to all things is that power which fashions their being. Next to us, the grandest laws are continually being executed. Next to us is not the workman whom we have hired and with whom we love so well to talk, but the workman whose work we are." Now, Thoreau's borrowings from Christian frameworks raise the question of whether he could be called Christian by any stretch. It does not appear that he could. Excuse me. One important figure in Western religion whom Thoreau all but ignores is Jesus. The term Jesus Christ appears once in Walden, and in his journal it appears once in his own voice and once in quotation. Now, Thoreau does refer often simply to Christ several times, but always as a literary, historical, or moral reference to the central figure of the Gospels, and usually as a literary cudgel in his critique of the church or of American society, rather than as an expression of personal faith. The catkins of the willow were the only redeemers that Thoreau acknowledged. But like other transcendentalists, Thoreau had a push-pull relationship with Jesus, alternately admiring and demoting him, and sometimes in the same sentence. The humanity, voluntary poverty, practical morality, concern for the poor, and radicalness of Jesus appealed to Thoreau. He revered his teaching, saying, quote, "It is not necessary to be a Christian to appreciate the beauty and significance of the life of Christ," close quote. 3 days after the abolitionist John Brown was arrested following his attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, 3 days later, Thoreau wrote, "If Christ should appear on earth today, he would likely be denounced as a mistaken, misguided man, insane and crazed." Now, even among Thoreau's contemporaries who recognized his deep spirituality, few thought of Thoreau as Christian. But Louisa May Alcott did, at least right after his funeral, at which her father, Bronson Alcott, had read from Thoreau's writings. So Louisa writes a letter to a friend 2 days later, and she says, "Father read selections from Henry's own books, for many people said he was an infidel, and as he never went to church when living, he ought not to be carried there dead." Well, if ever a man was a real Christian, it was Henry, and I think his own wise and pious thoughts, which were read by one who loved him, and whose life was a beautiful example of religious faith, convinced many and touched the hearts of all. Although the creativity of Thoreau's religious thought and its centrality to his life's work is increasingly being recognized by scholars, he did not leave a clearly marked or easy-to-follow spiritual path. Indeed, Thoreau's spirituality is characterized by a series of baffling paradoxes. He was a deeply religious person without a religion. He rejected the personality of God, as he called it, but often portrayed a personal creator. He was an ultra-radical reformer in the Protestant tradition, and yet he had a sacramental view of nature. He saw historical Christianity as a failure, but he framed his religious views in its scripture and verse. Scholars have found some 500 allusions to the Bible in Thoreau's writings. I can't overstate how well he knew at least the King James Version of the Bible, and how deeply it influenced his writing. They're often very hidden, so that all of a sudden, say, oh my gosh, he's referring to, foxes in their holes. That's, so quite a number of, and so there's that paradox that he used this, the poetics of Christianity. And Thoreau said, our spirits never go beyond nature, and he also said, we must look through and beyond her. So, and he loved the earth so much that he looked forward to being buried in its soil, and yet he alluded to heaven as a metaphor literally hundreds of times in his journal. I think the central paradox is that last one I mentioned, the tension between his palpable love of this green earth and his yearning for a mystical dimension of reality that he describes variously as another world, that other world, or a distant shore. Several times, Thoreau said that the actual world of sensory experience was less real to him than this world that he intuited. Now, this is hard to square with the more familiar earthbound Thoreau, the well-known green Thoreau, who was indeed at home in nature and who saw the natural world as a source of physical, mental, and spiritual health. I'm missing a page of my talk, but I'm going to just wing it here. So the Thoreau, Thoreau's mysticism did not conflict with his materialism, because he said there is another world, but it's inside this world that we think we know so well. His work as a naturalist in the 1850s was an expression of his contemplation of the holiness of matter, so that his study of when he studied marigolds, his materialism in looking at them was his mysticism, and spiritual seekers today are discovering a chord of recognition in Thoreau's eclectic, experiential, and non-institutional spirituality. He appeals to people who are looking, as the late great nature writer Barry Lopez wrote, for anyone who could speak the language of the God of no particular religion. Now, this isn't because Thoreau's religious views are being newly discovered, least of all by me, but because American culture has come around to embrace them. Indeed, Thoreau's religious naturalism is a factor in his popularity today. Now, Thoreau is not unique in the annals of religious history. He stands in a long line of liberalizing reformers, including Protestant forerunners such as John Huss or John Wycliffe, the Quaker mystic George Fox, the antinomian or anti-law Puritans who put having the Spirit of Christ in their hearts above the law of Moses, and his fellow transcendentalists, especially Emerson, all of whom sought a truer, more interior form of religion. Now, Thoreau's religious thought bears lesser or greater relation to all of them, but he formulated his religion from his own experience rather than his reading. If Thoreau has greater influence today in American religion than those other free thinkers, it is because he articulated that liberal religious vision with an originality, courage, clarity, sincerity, vividness, and beauty that few have. Thank you very much.